Hello guys, welcome to Golden Villains. Today, I bring you the tale of one of, if not the greatest Mexican drug cartel leader, El Chapo. Stay tuned. Joaquín Guzmán, in full, Joaquín Archivaldo Guzmán Loera, by name El Chapo, aka Shorty, was born in 1957 in La Tuna, Badiraguato, Sinaloa, Mexico. He was head of the Sinaloa drug cartel, one of the most powerful crime organizations in Mexico from the late 20th century. Guzman was born and raised in Badiraguato municipality, an impoverished and remote area of Sinaloa state in northwestern Mexico. That was the birthplace of many notorious drug traffickers. He began his criminal career in the 1980s as a member of the Guadalajara drug cartel, headed by Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Guzman rapidly rose through the ranks of the organization. When it disbanded in the late 1980s, he became a leader in the Sinaloa cartel. Under his guidance, the Sinaloa cartel developed creative smuggling techniques and strategies, including building air-conditioned tunnels under the Mexico-U.S. border, hiding drugs in chili pepper cans and fire extinguishers, and catapulting drugs over the border. His organization produced and smuggled various kinds of illicit drugs, including marijuana, heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine. In 1993, Guzman was arrested in Guatemala and extradited to Mexico. There, he was tried and acquitted on charges of murder, but found guilty of drug trafficking and possession of firearms, and eventually was sentenced to more than 20 years in a maximum security prison. In exchange for bribes, however, he was granted extensive liberties by prison authorities who allowed him to continue managing the criminal organization. According to various sources, he became head of the cartel in 1995. In 2001, he escaped with the help of corrupt prison guards. A subsequent investigation led to the arrest on corruption charges of many employees of the prison, including its warden. In the early 21st century, Guzman was believed to be responsible for most of the marijuana and cocaine trafficked from Colombia and Mexico to the United States, and to be the largest smuggler of methamphetamine in the Asia-Mexico-U.S. triangle, in which methamphetamine was produced in Mexico with Asian-made chemicals and then smuggled to the United States. His net worth was estimated at $1 billion by Forbes magazine in 2009, and some accounts put the annual revenue of his cartel at $3 billion. In Mexico, Guzman's fame rose to the level of folklore. He was glorified by some as a hero of the people, and his life story was set to song in many popular narcocorridos, also called drug ballads. The US government came to regard Guzman as a priority target in its war on drugs. In 2004, the US government announced a $5 million reward for information leading to Guzman's arrest on federal drug charges. In 2012, the US Department of the Treasury, which called Guzman the world's most powerful drug trafficker, invoked the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act to freeze the US assets of members of his family. In the first decade of the 21st century, the Sinaloa cartel engaged in bloody battles with rival cartels and Mexican law enforcement authorities that claimed the lives of tens of thousands of people. In 2006, a full-scale offensive against the drug cartels by the Mexican army resulted in the arrest of many traffickers, but failed to destroy the major cartels or to capture Guzmán. After years spent in hiding, Guzmán was apprehended in Mazatlan, Mexico in February 2014. His arrest was the result of a weeks-long operation by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and the Mexican Marines. On the night of July 11, 2015, Guzmán once again escaped custody, fleeing the maximum security Altiplano prison near Toluca through a shaft beneath the shower in his cell to a more than 1 mile long tunnel that led to a house on a construction site. The lofty 5.6 feet high wood reinforced tunnel through which Guzmán fled had lighting and ventilation, indicating that it had been in the works for some time. A motorcycle apparently had been used within the tunnel during its digging to remove soil. A massive manhunt was mounted and questions were almost immediately raised about the possibility of official complicity in the escape, which came as a huge blow to President Enrique Peña Nieto, who had made the crackdown on drug cartels a cornerstone of his new administration and who had trumpeted Guzmán's capture as a pivotal triumph. On January 8, 2016, it was announced that Guzmán had been captured in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, after a shootout. The following year, he was extradited to the United States, where he was charged with various crimes, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and murder conspiracy. His trial began in November 2018 amid intense security. In February 2019, he was found guilty of all the charges against him, and 5 months later, he was sentenced to life in prison. And that's all for this video. Guzmán is currently locked up somewhere in a maximum security prison. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your thoughts in the comment section, and also don't forget to like and subscribe, and while you are at it, please hit the notification button so you, my friend, don't get to miss out any new uploads. Thank you so much, and see you all next time.